In 2019, Vice TV premiered one of the most intriguing TV series in history. In a world where the spectacle of professional wrestling captivates millions, there exists a side of the sport behind kayfabe that is rarely explored. Welcome to Dark Side of the Ring, a gripping documentary series that delves deep into the untold stories of tragedy, scandal, and controversy in the world of professional wrestling. Join us as we uncover the jaw-dropping, heart-wrenching, and oftentimes twisted tales that have plagued the professional wrestling world and gain a newfound perspective on an industry that has long been shrouded in mystery and myth. Get ready to be enthralled, shocked, and moved by the compelling narratives that await. In the world of professional wrestling, where heroes and villains clash in the ring, there exists a dark side filled with secrets, scandals, and untold stories. This is Dark Side of the Ring. Series 1 kicked off with the iconic love story of Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth exploring their rise to fame, the highs of their on-screen romance, and the heartbreaking lows that led to their real-life separation. This was a great episode to kick the series off with, since this was such a famous relationship. The Montreal Screwjob is next and revisits the controversial events surrounding the infamous match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, exposing the backstage politics that unfolded, forever changing the landscape of professional wrestling. The episode that follows that covers Bruiser Brody and the life and tragic death of Frank Goodish, aka Bruiser Brody, a beloved and larger-than-life wrestler who met a violent end in a locker room altercation, shedding light on the darker side of the wrestling business. The fourth episode explores the tragic tale of the Von Erich family, once wrestling royalty, but plagued by personal and professional hardships that ultimately led to the untimely deaths of several family members. This is the real story that the Iron Claw is based on. The tragedy of Gino Hernandez is episode 5 and explores the mysterious death of the flamboyant Texas wrestling sensation Gino Hernandez, unraveling the circumstances that surrounded his untimely demise. Season 1 ends on the controversial legacy of Fabulous Moolah, a pioneering female wrestler whose influence is marred by allegations of exploitation and mistreatment of women in the industry. Season 2 premiered in early 2020, and it expanded to 8 episodes. It delved deeper into the stories and controversies within the world of professional wrestling. The second season featured a wide range of topics and personalities. The highlights of this show are not only in the classic footage and the talking heads, but in the dramatic recreations of events. The first 2 episodes of Season 2 focused on the Benoit family tragedy. It details how Chris and Nancy got together and the events surrounding the end of their lives. It was a very emotional episode featuring David Benoit and Nancy's sister. The episode about New Jack's career and his many controversial in-ring moments followed that 2-part opener. Hearing directly from New Jack really made this episode, as well as seeing footage from many of these incidents. Episode 4 concerns the Brawl for All tournament. This was an ill-fated tournament that negatively affected the careers of all involved. Ironically, it ruined the WWF run for the man it was created to kickstart, Dr. Death Steve Williams. The next episode covered Jimmy Snuka and the situation surrounding the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Argentino. This was something that Snuka was suspected for, yet only started to face justice near the end of his life. Dino Bravo's assassination followed the Jimmy Snuka episode and continues the theme of mystery surrounding a death in wrestling. This brought light to a wrestling story that I knew little about. The theme is further continued in the Herb Abrams story. This continues the mysterious death motif, but wraps it up in such a wild story. The second to last story featured on the Road Warriors. It talks about the rise of their career together and Hawk's personal downfall. The final story of Season 2 featured the tragic death of Owen Hart. This was a major episode because outside of her book, Owen's widow and family have been relatively quiet. This was a great look into not only Owen, but also as to what a great family life he had. Season 3 of Dark Side of the Ring premiered in 2021, and after the success of the first 2 seasons, this series continued to feature both stories that were well-known and lesser-known. Dark Side of the Ring repeated what they did in Season 2 by kicking off with the first 2 episodes covering one story, and this time it was Brian Pillman. It was interesting hearing from the various members of his family. Episode 3 featured the most recent subject, and that was Nick Gage. This guy is legendary in the deathmatch community, and this was just about the biggest stage that he had been on up to that point. They followed that episode up by returning to detailing an event, and this time it was the Collision in Korea event. This is not only a wild story about the biggest wrestling show ever, but the experience the wrestlers had over there is wild. Collision in Korea was followed up by the Ultimate Warrior episode. The Ultimate Warrior is a notorious character in the wrestling business, and that made this episode one to look forward to. They followed maybe the most notorious character in wrestling history with one of the most notorious out-of-the-ring events in the Plane Ride from Hell. This episode was notorious not only for the subject matter, but the real-life repercussions that resulted from it. Chris Canyon's story followed the Plane Ride from Hell and really showcases the range of stories that this show presents. The wildness picks back up with the story of Onita's FMW. This episode not only told the wild story of FMW, but the tragic injury to Hayabusa. The FMW story is followed by a lesser known but no less wild story of Johnny Canine. This was a wild story that not a lot of people knew about. Luna Vachon is the next story presented and was a very interesting peek behind one of the wildest female wrestling personas that have ever existed. Rob Black's XPW is the second to last episode of Season 3. This was a wild story of a promotion not only because of the extreme violence, but also the relation to the porn industry. Dark Side of the Ring Season 3 closed out with the steroid trials. Since this was a big WWE scandal, this was interesting episode to see the coverage on. And they had been so successful with 3 seasons of this that Dark Side of the Ring Season 4 premiered in early 2023. Between Seasons 3 and 4, there was some discussion about whether the series would continue. Tales from the Territories had come out in the meantime and continued the old school wrestling talk. It did that with a roundtable discussion of wrestling personalities and classic footage. Season 4 of Dark Side of the Ring returned to opening up with a one-part episode on a subject, and that subject was Chris Candido and Tammy Sytch. The episode showed Chris's love for and rise in the business. It showed his love for Tammy and how that affected him. Tammy's downfall is also covered. The Chris and Tammy story was followed up by Magnum TA. This is one episode that could be classified the light side of the ring. The Magnum TA crash is one of the biggest cases of what could have been in the wrestling business. I came away from this one really admiring Magnum's spirit. The third episode of Season 4 was one of the most powerful episodes they've ever produced. The episode featured the story of the Graham family and their tragedies. It's Von Erich-esque in the amount of suicides, but Mike Stoddard really stands out by trying to break the cycle. The Graham story was followed up by the Doink the Clown story. Matt Bourne, the man most famously associated with playing Doink, was the focus of this episode. Episode 5 covered the Junkyard Dog, covered how important the dog was to the area he wrestled in, and how sad his downfall was. Junkyard Dog was followed by Adrian Adonis. Adrian Adonis was known for playing an effeminate character, but was a real-life tough guy. Abdullah the Butcher was covered in episode 7. This gave an interesting look behind the character and featured the story of him infecting Hannibal later in his career. Another is Big Man is covered in the next episode, where Bam Bam Bigelow's story is featured. The second to last episode covered in Season 4 is Bash at the Beach 2000. It examined why this event went down the way it did. And the final episode of Season 4 was the highly anticipated Marty Jannetty episode. This episode not only covered his many career failings, but his outside of the ring episodes as well.